Awesome. All right. Well, good morning. Welcome. I'm Heavenly Johnson. I am very lucky. I get the pleasure of leading our marketing team here at Reforge. So really excited. This morning, we've got a great group of marketing leaders. And so we're going to be chatting about how do you think about building really cohesive and high-performing marketing teams. We will jump into intros in just a bit, but really quick note, if you've got questions, we're going to hold some time at the end. So if you'll drop them into the Q&A function over chat, so go with Q&A, then we will hold some time once we get there. So to get us going, we're going to get started with a quick lightning round for the panel. Quick intros, what are you up to? 3 questions. So your favorite breakfast food, best piece of advice you've ever gotten, might be marketing, might not. And then what marketing product is making your life easier right now? So to start, I will hand it to Kyle.
Cool. Thanks, Heavenly. Thanks for having me. Hey, everyone. I'm Kyle Dunhoff. I'm a director of marketing at HubSpot. I work on our media and acquisition team, primarily focused on top of funnel demand gen, HubSpot blogs, YouTube channels, podcasts, offers, and so on. My favorite breakfast food during the week, it's just a cup of coffee. I don't do a lot with breakfast, but on the weekends, there's a great diner down the street. My wife and I hit that up for an omelet and home fries. So that tends to be my go-to. Piece of advice that I've gotten just in preparation for this, I was just thinking about it. This comes from my dad, more like just a piece of life advice. Work hard and do the right thing even when it's difficult. He used to always have me like do yard work, and then afterwards I'd have to do yard work for my elderly neighbor. And I was like, I don't want to do this. And he was like, well, we got to do the right thing and put in the work. And I think that carries into everything that you do. And what marketing product is making my life easier? Am I allowed to say HubSpot? HubSpot is by far my favorite tool, but I will say HubSpot paired with some of the AI tools, ChatGPT has made its way into my daily workflow and figuring out how to get some things done a little faster and out the door has been incredibly, incredibly beneficial this year. But that's me.
Awesome. Annie, if you'll pop in with an intro.
Great. Good morning, everyone. My name is Annie. I'm a co-founder of Pen Night Collective. We're a group of builders that offer advisory, consulting, and fractional services. And so I currently advise a series of different startups. Let's see, my favorite breakfast food. I'm from Hawaii, so I love a good loco moco in the morning. It's hearty, it's savory, and it hits all the spots. So that would be my go-to. The best piece of advice I've gotten this advice from several people, so it goes to show how amazing it is, which is one, your career isn't linear. So I think we all have goals, an end game, but it's important to remember that it's going to have a roller coaster of ups and downs, which means you also have to have courage to walk away from something that doesn't align with your values versus the end goal itself. And so oftentimes we optimize for bigger titles or more money or better gig. But I think we often forget about what drives us internally and intrinsically. What marketing product is making my life easier? It's a bit cliche to say AI, so I'll say specifically Midjourney, because I'm not a designer and I've been fortunate to work with lots of designers, but as an entrepreneur, I need to, sometimes create graphics in a pinch. And so Midjourney has been a real clutch.
Awesome. Jordan, if you'll intro yourself.
Hey everybody, I'm Jordan Huang. I'm the VP of Marketing over at OpenPhone. OpenPhone is the highest rated customer communication platform on G2. We really sort of focus on small businesses and helping them really connect and be able to grow their relationships with the customers, mainly through the phone. Favorite breakfast food for me, I'm a California kid, so breakfast burritos is top of mind. I actually have an affinity for breakfast tacos because breakfast burritos are a little bit too big sometimes in the morning. And so breakfast tacos are a bit of like the right size for me sometimes. And the best piece of advice I've ever gotten, I would say, is I don't think it's actually like been explicitly stated, but it's one that that I think I've just learned through the experience and also like try to teach on to the kids. It's just like embrace the struggle. We all love to do things, and also like sometimes things just get hard, and it's learning how to get through the hard parts that that kind of like make it to allow us to enjoy those other aspects of it. Um, and then what marketing product is making your life easier? Everybody said AI, so I'll stay away from that one. One of the ones for me is Census, the reverse ETL. Being able to just kind of pipe your data away and into all the other platforms that need to make use of it is just such a huge kind of like value add, and being able to do that without having to ask an engineer all the time is I think better for their life and better for my life as well. So yeah.
Thanks. And then Austin, if you'll round us out.
Sure. Hi, everybody. My name's Austin. I'm the co-founder of Clarify. We're a next generation CRM and data platform for early startups. Before I was the co-founder of Clarify, I was the head of MarTech at Ramp, and I teach a MarTech class at Reforge as well. 3 questions. Favorite food. So I'm not usually a big breakfast food guy. I tend to just have a cup of coffee and maybe toast. But if I'm gonna go for breakfast, say it's vacation or brunch, I'll go for chilaquiles, which are just amazing. Love Mexican food for breakfast. Best piece of advice I've ever gotten. I didn't get this directly. I read it, so I don't know if that counts, but it's carried with me in my career quite a lot. It's advice from Ben Horowitz, and he talks about this idea of following your contribution. And it was very informative for me early in my career when I was thinking about what I wanted to do and how I wanted to contribute to different companies. And the premise is that you should, rather than following your passion, which is often pretty mercurial and vague when you're really early in your career, you should find the things that you're really good at where you add value, and you should keep pursuing threads that allow you to contribute to a company or an institution. That's been a really great framework for me as I've thought about my own career, and I tend to love giving that advice to other people. And then the last question is, what marketing product is making your life easier? I'm going to take a little bit of a turn here just because there's a lot of marketing products that are great. A product that makes all marketing products better is your browser. And recently I have like fallen in love with this browser called Arc. It's basically built on Chrome, but it's just for some reason such a better experience. It's faster. You can have workspaces. The bookmarks make a ton of sense. And yeah, the speed is just incredible. It kind of continues to amaze me that as you know, as we build more products and we have more software that's helping our life, something as simple as just like speed continues to remain a differentiator. So if you're looking for a new browser or if you think Chrome is slow, you should go check out Arc.
Oh, it's interesting. All right. Well, thanks so much. So thanks for the intros. We've got, as I mentioned, a great cast, and so wanted to go ahead and dive into questions. As noted, if you've got more questions from the audience, put those in the Q&A and we'll get to those at the end. Um, to get us started, I'd love to hear from everyone on this one. Hypothetically, like let's say that you were to break out your month into 10 blocks of time. How would you think about like how many of those units of time you would recommend that leaders are spending thinking and focusing on how the team is operating? And kind of how do you think about that? Jordan, I can kick it to you to start.
Cool. So I'd say I have a number of answers on this one. I think like right now what I spend is probably about like 2 units of time, so like maybe like a day out of the week on this. And I'll say like I don't think it's enough, frankly. I feel like there are often times where I'll catch myself being late to being able to like deliver like a meaningful agenda onto a team meeting, all this other stuff, which kind of like just negatively impacts the team, right? And their ability to understand what's going on, why it matters, and all those other things. My kind of like typical response is probably about 3 units of time. But I actually think like that changes in a remote environment. And so like in a remote environment, I actually think it's like more like 5. And that's mostly because it's so hard for individuals to get context anywhere outside of like the day-to-day. There's no sitting in the office, there's no listening in on conversations and all those other things. And so I think like because of that requires a lot more effort to be placed into ensuring that they understand and that they're all aligned with what's going on, why are the things that they're working on important, why are other teams prioritizing the things that they're prioritizing, and making sure that things are really cohesive.
Yeah, just to jump in there, Jordan, I think you're right. I think remote's been a big factor. Like, how do we manage teams? How do we operate? Because it felt like early on we kind of overcompensated and there were more meetings and more Slacks. And we talked about Slack being used as a weapon, like you're just getting hit all day and you're like, is it actually that urgent? Do I need to respond right now? When we were thinking about just like to add another input here is like, what's the maturity level of your team and the stage of your team? I think early on, you're going to iterate on your team's operating system, their rituals, their meeting cadence, their communications. And so I could make an argument right now. We're going through a change internally at HubSpot. I'm spending 6 to 7 units of time on this after a quarter of change and trying to figure out, okay, what are the jobs to be done for the team? Who should be meeting? What can we take out of the calendar? But for some other teams I've been on in the past where really mature teams, programs that have been up and running 3 or 4 years, you don't have to spend as much time on it. I think you're carving out, time once a month, twice a month to really just think through what's working, how do I fill some gaps on the team. But I've always looked at it from just a maturity stage standpoint, and I think you have to kind of evaluate your team and the business you're in, and allocate that amount of time accordingly.
Yeah, I'll jump in and agree that it really depends on the needs of the team and needs of the business at a time. So I don't think there's like a black and white answer to this question, but simply put, I like to live by the 60/40 or the 70/30 rule when I look at units of time or anything, and guided by two things being the head and the heart. And so from a head perspective, things like strategy and operations, are we on track to hit business goals, or looking at the marketing calendar, making sure that we have enough lead time to work towards a launch or a campaign, budgeting, so all those more operational components. And then the second thing being your heart, that's obviously related to the people on your team. Things like team alignment, are they happy in their jobs? Are they productive? And is there enough time for performance feedback and career guidance? And I think things always ebbs and flows depending on, again, the needs of the business or the team in a given time. And so that 70/30 or 60/40 split could really flip at any given point. So it's more about being very observant to ensure that you're aligning for the needs. But one last thing is I'm also a really big fan of blocking downtime. So blocking things to whether, catching up on industry trends or just getting stuff done. I'm a big fan of just blocking a chunk of time in every single week so that I have time to do those things.
Awesome. Austin, thoughts here on how you might allocate that time?
Yeah, I largely agree with what everybody said. I would just maybe add a couple of key tactical thoughts. One is I think I think marketing leaders and actually just leaders in general often over-index on the stuff that's easy. And they have one-on-ones, for example, that kind of like sprawl their calendar and they find themselves in this position where they have lots of time with their people, but they're not actually spending that time in a meaningful way. So I like to kind of reduce the amount of time that I have on one-on-ones and actually create moments where I can just connect with people in a more serendipitous way. It does require some organization. You have to like think about how often I've connected with my team, what am I trying to achieve, what are their goals. But I like the idea of thinking about one-on-ones more as a structured set of documents and then figuring out the time and moments to connect with people when they're either doing work or when the moment calls for it. Likewise, I think that we're a generation of leaders where there's an expectation of contributing and directing deep work. So I think like, increasingly the number of CMOs and VPs of marketing who don't get their hands dirty is going away. And so I like to carve out a pretty significant amount of time to either doing deep work, contributing to deep work, evaluating or directing deep work, and just making sure I show up for the people that I'm working for and helping lend my experience to the work that they're doing day to day, especially as a technical marketer. I think that's really valuable. And then the last one is I think that there's this tendency to not prioritize learning as like a core construct of your job. And so I think this suggestion had already been given, but it's like carving out the time to learn. I treat like learning as like a P0 job to be done for any type of marketing leader, because we're in an age where we're obviously observing things happening so quickly. And if you don't take the time to get into the weeds of how things work, try to think about how it applies strategically to your company, it's not even just industry trends. It's also like, what are other people doing? What's the latest in terms of how this will affect my business? So I think like, across the board, those three things, minimize your one-on-one time, but do it in a meaningful way. Make sure that you're contributing to deep work as much as you can, and then make sure to carve out time learning. Those are three things that I think are really important as you consider how to spend your time.
Awesome. Thank you. I'm curious about marketing team structure. I know we've all kind of seen different forms and ways that people approach it. I know we've seen things like aligning on verticals and business units, or maybe you might align around channels, or maybe it's more around like skill sets and folks' knowledge domains, or maybe it's something else altogether. I'm curious like how you have thought about structure in your marketing teams. And I'll open it to whoever.
I can go first. I mean, I'm generally a fan of aligning towards just business goals, right? I think like at the end of the day, even like with a broad mandate as like marketing as a whole, there's generally like two or three priorities that you're really trying to achieve, right? And so structuring the teams in such a way where they ladder up to those goals, in a way from like an individual all the way up to the leader, around that project is becomes like a really meaningful thing. I mean, I think like in the past, I've also been in part of like ones where we've done something that's a little bit more like centers of excellence. And I think like that makes sense just depending upon like the structure of the organization. But that's because like effectively like the structure of the organization has like a broader set of goals, uh, uh, that sort of like it's a little bit harder to ladder up to individually as a marketing team. And so like the centers of excellence make a lot more sense within like that sort of like perspective. Um, but I do think like in general, really understanding kind of like which teams are needed to like achieve goals and then laddering them appropriately. I found that to be just a lot more um, natural way of thinking for me in terms of alignment and getting people kind of like working together appropriately.
Yeah, to Jordan's point, just to hop in there, it's definitely goal based. I think the way we think about it when we go into planning seasons, like what are the core objectives and what are our strategies to hit those objectives, and what are the jobs that have to be done to help us get there? And like you're starting to put teams and people in place. Just pulling on the thread of like maturity or size of company, I think when you're a smaller company, maybe have one or two product lines, you're probably in more of a vertical structure, right? Where your marketing team, you have like brand and PR, you have content, you have demand gen, you have product, all contributing to this larger goal of growing this one or two products. As your company gets much bigger, you have multiple product lines. I've worked at companies with 60,000 employees and 12 business units. Like at that point, you're starting to get more horizontal in nature, more cross matrix teams. And so I think you have a bit of both where you have the centers of excellence that Jordan's talking about, but you also have people that are really focused on one of the product lines. And so they have to be more multidisciplinary, and be able to work with those centers of excellence to pull on each of those levers to achieve their goal. So I do think it depends. Early on, you're probably finding folks who have a very specific skill set focused on achieving that one goal. And then as you build out, you'll add in some more generalists that are able to work across those teams.
Yeah, I mean, this has been talked about already, but I think like two things that come to mind are size, stage, maturity of company, and then also the people who are at your company at those moments in time. I think folks often fail to recognize that like marketing teams in particular often take the form of the teams around them based on product and engineering. So for example, at an early stage company, you might have a really strong EPD org that drives a lot of like your decisioning around technology and platforms, which then affects both your go-to-market motion as well as your MarTech motion. And so what happens is there's this kind of belief that your marketing team is just in a silo, but it actually is very much a reflection of the VP director level folks around you. The second observation I have too is that I think a lot of teams tend to just lump things together into this word called growth when in fact they should be delineating them much more clearly, like we've talked about. This happens actually a lot earlier in a company's life cycle than you'd expect. Even as early as something Series C, Series B, you should be thinking about, what type of channel is this? What skill sets are needed? Are these domain level respects? I think two or three of the companies I've worked through over the years, they've kept growth as kind of a dump all bucket for different marketing divisions for far too long. And my observation is actually marketing is a very big collection of highly specialized individuals. And the question is, at what point in time do you start to specialize? When do you generalize different skill sets? And when do you actually use the moment to double down or focus on a particular domain in marketing that's going to help your business succeed? And I think like as you scale, that clarity just becomes more and more reinforced. So again, repeating a lot of what other folks said, but I think having clarity around the people around you and how they affect marketing, and then what stage you're at and what goals you're trying to achieve really help influence how you structure your marketing team.
Yeah, I've had a few conversations with folks recently where we talk about sort of like just like the overall breadth of marketing and like all the different sort of like functions that it covers and all of those other things. And so you could have like on a numbers basis, you could have a fairly like decent sized team, and yet you could have like no coverage, right? Because everybody's like really good at their individual role, but like you can't take a product marketer and throw them into, paid marketing. You can take a paid marketer and throw them into social or things like that, right? And so like there's a lot of it's a lot harder to be really like fungible here. And so a lot of the decisions that you have to make are really dependent upon like, do you need a generalist? Do you need a specialist? Like, what do you think are going to be like the ways that you really want to be able to win as a team and as a company, as well as to some degree, it's just kind of like what's the maturity of like your team itself, right? I think like depending on the size of the company you have, you probably have either like folks that are a little bit more junior, but like a lot more hungry, don't have as much experience, but are just willing to just kind of like try a bunch of things. And like that's really useful up to a certain point. And then there's also some pieces of it where you sit there and say, hey, I really want to win here. And for me to win here means that like actually you need to like have like a strong sort of center of excellence here. And that's not always going to be the most junior people, or like the hungriest people. Junior and hungry, I should say, not just the hungriest piece, but like you actually want people who have seen a lot of different things because they have a little bit more reason as to why they were doing tactic A versus tactic B. And oftentimes when you have folks that are kind of like growing within a singular org, they've only seen the thing that they see. And I think like this goes a little bit back over to like Austin, what you were saying, and Austin, and Andy, what you were saying about like taking time to learn and learning what does everybody else do in the everybody else do outside of the industry, and like why are they making those choices? What really kind of like feeds into some of those decisions. Like that's just really important for everybody to be able to generate, not just leaders, but also just anybody who wants to be really great in their role.
Yeah, just to jump on that piece, I think I love the idea of like giving people context around like where they sit in the system. And like one thing we talk a lot about, Jordan, what you mentioned is like continue learning, but also like learn what your peers are doing. Like we coached all of our ICs on going into conversations with other teams just by asking questions. Be like, speak last. You don't have to share exactly what our goals and what you need from that team. Ask them questions. What are their goals? What are they trying to accomplish? What are their resources? And how can we find a solution for our teams to work together? I think if you take a time to like document your team and the state of the world and give your team members context, they can actually operate a lot faster and a lot more and be a lot more impactful just by knowing, okay, here's my role in this larger system. Here are these teams and how I can partner with them. I think that's really smart.
Yeah, generally right sizing the team to the needs of the business makes a lot of sense. I've seen this in my own career from pre-seed to post-IPO companies. And I might be somewhat contrarian in my point of view that as a rule of thumb, I like to lean a little bit leaner. And it's a big learning that I got from Amazon. It's being frugal is one of the kind of leadership principles, but Because I believe that constraints tend to lead to creativity. And right now, I think we're all feeling the pinch, but sometimes it's during these tight moments when some of the best ideas are born. And so one kind of barometer that I look at is how much impact and output are we getting from the team and the velocity in which we're pushing things live. And it could be something simple like an email or a social post that really, performs well. It doesn't have to be such a big win, but even like little wins and using that as a way of, what is the right structure and are people gelling and moving towards the right direction. And my last kind of rule of thumb is when I first join a company and building a team, I try to avoid layering too quickly. I believe that teams need layers and the right support from their managers, but I tend to avoid layering too quickly before the team has had a chance to make an impact.
Awesome. Thank y'all. A couple of you touched on kind of thinking about your team, relationship to other teams in the org. I'm curious, how do you think about demonstrating the impact of your marketing team to the broader organization?
Go for
You're
it.
good, Jordan. Me? All right. I think, well, one, we're marketers, right? So we should naturally be good storytellers. I think like that's a big piece of this is we need to figure out how do we tell this story around how our work impacts the larger organization. And sometimes that's really easy to do because we have channels that directly can be directly attributed to leads or sales and revenue. I will say, like, as you move up in the organization and you're talking to leadership and your finance partners, you have to be able to tell that story and tie it back to value and revenue for the business. And I think marketers that really start to understand the return on the investments that we're making tend to be very successful inside their orgs because they're able to get buy-in not only from their leadership team, but finance, who will ultimately say, hey, let's give that team some additional resources to continue growing and experimenting. And so I think as you're kind of building out your team, building out your org, spend time on your narrative and your internal communications. How am I going to talk about my work to leadership and finance? How am I going to talk about my work to my team? And there should be a thread there, obviously, but I do think you change the positioning slightly. And your teams also want to be like working towards something greater than themselves. And so I do think you're able to kind of craft that story of here's the larger objective of the company and how we all contribute to that. So I do think you have to figure out who am I talking to and then what's that message that I'm going to be sending out. The last thing I'll say on this is you do have to repeat it, right? Everybody's running quick, receiving Slacks all day long. We have this thing called partner day, like set up time with your partners, walk them through what you're doing, talk them through some of the ways that you can partner together and how their work actually helps you. And I think figuring out who those partners are and what those comms are can help you move quickly.
Yeah, I love that, Kyle. I think just a couple things to add because so often in marketing we have to balance this world between sharing a great story but also presenting the numbers. And organizations flex one way or the other. I find particularly mature organizations know that numbers matter, but there's often more to the story than the numbers, especially when you talk about brand marketing. Like a really common mistake I've seen in early marketing teams is they try to value everything so much that when you hit an obstacle that can't be valued, then you start getting into these problems around, what's the worth of different marketing efforts. So I actually think it's really important to balance storytelling with the right metrics and try to create an atmosphere and environment where teams understand the importance of both, because in marketing, both are very, very important. And the other thing I would say, especially because marketing teams are more numbers driven now and metrics driven, there's more of a reliance on cross-functional partners to achieve those goals using tools and technology. So I think like when you think about it from that perspective, usually in a marketing team, you have some type of MarOps or MarTech function that's helping the marketing team use tools and technology to achieve those goals. And they're direct in relationship to your EPD org. And often the EPD org is the only way you can achieve your outcomes that you want. And so that requires leadership to create empathy across many different supporting functions and cross-functional domains. And depending on the organization, the culture, and the style, that also might mean earning the respect from the product organization or earning the respect needed from the engineering org to demonstrate knowledge and empathy in their domain, so that as you're working on objectives together, you have that partnership can achieve your goals. I think one of the most common things I've seen in marketing teams that are struggling, especially when it relates to technology, is they're often kind of prone to this stigma that they don't understand technology or can't use it accordingly. And it's ironic because marketing teams often have the most disciplined technology goals to achieve. If you think about a B2B business trying to get your attribution pipeline set up, trying to get all that data into your CRM, you think about a B2C business trying to run growth performance ads, these are really complicated endeavors that require cross-functional support from other domains that marketing doesn't control. So again, when I think about what you said, Kyle, it's so important to bring people along that adventure in the story, and then also to create the narrative, both with supporting metrics as well as the empathy from technology and engineering teams, so that the story is more than just something that's created in a vacuum on a Google or Notion doc.
Yeah, in terms of the narrative, I do think storytelling is really important, and it should include the right metrics and appealing to the different audiences in a company. I also think that the marketing team's sole job is to also be the voice of the customer, because at the end of the day, who are we serving? And so making sure that customer voices are heard in decision making, how we prioritize, because I think that empathy is really directed towards the people who are going to be supporting your product or service at the end of the day. So that's the one last thing I'll add about how we tell the story.
Yeah, and I think to go a little one step beyond that as well, it's also sort of, I think, really important for us to ensure that just across the company there's there's a central understanding of who that customer is, what are the problems that we're solving for, and ultimately how we want to solve for that. I think and especially I think as leaders, that it is our role in a lot of ways, is to ensure that the rest of that leadership team is saying and believing the same things, because that's actually the biggest point of where if there's a lack of alignment there, things start to fall apart really easily. And so ensuring that not only that leaders are aligned in that, but they're also consistently saying the same message is just such a huge piece of making sure that the organization as a whole understands what's important, why are we solving for the things that we're solving for, and everything else down the line.
I completely agree with you, Jordan. I think one of the hardest jobs of being a marketing leader at any company is the role of educating what we do, but also the who we're serving, and making sure that the whole company is in an alignment of who that customer is. That's a great point.
Awesome. So a little bit of a shift back to your own teams. I'm curious about, how do you think about performance reviews? And kind of with that, how would you recommend that leaders improve the way that they measure, the way that they evaluate the skills of the folks on their team?
I can start. I think that feedback should be given so regularly and often in the moment, as you're doing the work, so that when it comes to formal performance reviews, that there shouldn't be many surprises. And in fact, most of you are going through the motion of getting it written, but hopefully you have that kind of natural relationship, so that the performance feedback and reviewing is happening on a daily basis. And then I think there are ways to hack the actual review process, depending on the company, because some companies tend to overcomplicate the process. And so how can you find hacks to simplify it as much as possible? So that would be a couple of things that I tend to do when it comes to performance reviews.
I have
Yeah,
maybe
I think.
Oh, go
Oh,
ahead.
go ahead. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
Sorry about that. I was just going to add on to Andy's point. I do think this idea of the performance review starts before the performance review, right? It's about this idea of expectation setting and understanding where folks are. One of the biggest, I think, things that I didn't understand when I was in IC, and I now try to make sure that folks really understand is what what are the like implicit like expectations of like different levels, right? Like what are the expectations of a director versus somebody who's like an individual contributor? And what does it mean to like have like a level of impact at like that role that's different? Because I think like there's two pieces of it that come into play. One of the things is that um, your expectations as like a senior IC versus an individual IC are really different. And so once you get promoted, you can no longer think that I just do the same thing and I will get the same like result. Like that's just like not true. And I think like that's a piece that is um just needs to be like reinforced in a lot of ways. But I think the other piece of it is, and I felt this as being sort of like a much stronger kind of like technical IC, like coming up, is how do you actually have like influence across the rest of the organization? And what does that look like, especially as you get up into these upper levels? And how do you do that cross-functionally? And what is like the different types of skill sets that you actually have to like build and maintain? And how do they like roll together? And I think like that's what I found is like actually having that type of conversation of this is the expectation of like what a director looks like and how they work cross functionally and all these other things is a really strong component to aligning all the feedback that just kind of like follows along with that throughout the course of like just the year or whatever your cycle is.
Yeah, I I have maybe a little bit of a controversial opinion about performance reviews, and maybe I can say this because I still live in startup land and not a big corporation. But I often think that they're pretty big waste of time and with the way that they're constructed. I think the idea of a performance review is a very necessary part of human development at companies, but the way that it's instituted often doesn't lead to that outcome. And there's lots of studies actually that show that performance reviews like actually suppress the performance and productivity of a lot of employees. And I think what it really comes down to is complexity. You know, a lot of organizations as they scale, they start with something really simple and it's all about, hey, are people doing well? Do they feel supported? Do they feel loved? Are we grateful and are they paid well? And it's just a very simple model. But over time, there's this need to develop complexity, not only because the number of people you have and you can't give everybody what they want, but also you're trying to drive certain cultural outcomes around performance and are people the same? How do we value that? What is the monetary value of that? And I think like as you add that complexity, performance reviews often go really wrong and end up hurting your organization more than end up helping. And so my general advice for performance reviews is like as long as you possibly can, keep them simple and think about what is the underlying need for your team. Are you you know, do you have people who are still dealing with on Maslow's hierarchy of need, people who are dealing with safety needs, or like do they are they literally not making enough money, and what matters for them in this performance review is making more money, or are they not feeling like love and belonging in the organization? Do they not really feel like they have community? Do they need to feel kind of grateful for the opportunity that they have? So again, I think going back to the fundamentals of why do we do this? We do this to obviously evaluate people and create a culture around performance, but we really do it also to appreciate people and give them what is needed so that they stay in an organization and help you grow. So as long as possible, as if you can keep it simple, I know it's really hard to do. I think you'll find that the outcomes are more successful.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think that's fair coming from somebody at a big company that's complicated. I will say like our partners in HR have done a fantastic job. I mentioned earlier before the call, I've been with HubSpot for 5 years and trying to simplify. So I think like your message is definitely a good one, which is just how do we make this as clear as possible? And Jordan, you had mentioned just expectation settings. I think we should be setting expectations throughout the year so that when we get to that performance review, it's more of a coaching call. It's not necessarily something that's going to be a surprise. Hopefully, the manager and the team member completely aligned on how they've been doing throughout the year. Within each of our teams, everyone owns a number. So our teams have like team level goals that they're trying to hit. Some of our team members have either like a high level business goal they need to hit or a productivity number. And so that's just a gauge throughout the year. Like, am I meeting the expectations for the role? And to Austin's point around simplicity, we set expectations with like, we have high expectations and you're meeting those. And then there are some folks that are performing above those expectations, and there's some folks that are performing below those expectations. And when we come into the performance review, hopefully you know where you sit on that scale based on our conversations throughout the year. And then just be as open and honest and candid as you can with, here's why you're performing below, and we got to get you to the high expectations we have for the team, or you're one of our top performers and here's why, and really giving people not only the number but some of the qualitative feedback as well, to your point around influence, taking on some things that are outside the scope of their role. But it's so important up front to do the work on like role expectations, roles, responsibilities, goals, so that when you get to the performance review, it's an easier conversation and everyone's on the same page.
Awesome. So one more question from me, and then I'll jump to Q&A. So reminder to folks, either drop in questions or go in and upvote things, and we'll flip there shortly. But last question from my side. So we talked a bit about like developing the people in your team. Also curious about hiring and building out the team itself. Hiring's hard. I'm curious to get your thoughts. Like, how do you approach just hiring great marketers? There are things that are intangible, there's hard skills, there's skills that folks can learn. And on the flip side, like anything that for you is like a red flag in the hiring process.
I can start, I guess. So I think like there's intangibles that just individually like I prefer my team members to have. Like one of them for me is just like heavy like ability to like self-reflect and think about like what could they have done better and all of those things. And so um I prioritize that piece of it as I go through like the interview cycles and things like that. There are other pieces of it that I think are just really like role dependent, right? And so like what I would bring up is like there's effectively in general like three flavors of product marketers, right? There's like people that are really strategic, there's people that are really good at kind of like the customer insights aspect of it, and there's like all those other pieces of it. And so not going in understanding like what the role it is that you really need to solve for, and then trying to figure out like what flavor do you need is generally like generally like leads to just a misalignment in terms of like who you hire versus like what you need. um and so I think like actually, and this is something that I've picked up at other from like really strong like HR partners is being really good at understanding really like what are the must-haves for your role as you've designed it, right? Like I need somebody who needs to be like really good at this. And there's a little bit of like what you can start to determine from that standpoint is do you need somebody who's like really experienced here? Or are you looking for somebody who's like more willing to grow and there's like a little bit more room for them? And a portion of that is really dependent upon, I think, like what where does that role like kind of like fit within your organization as it relates to like goals, as well as just levels. And then the other piece of it then becomes this idea of like, what is it they have to be really good at? Do I need somebody who's like really good at cross-functional skills because like that's like a really just kind of core priority of that role? Or do we need somebody else that has like a slightly different flavor, right? And I think like that really helps when starting to put these through. The worst hires for me are the ones where I'm like, I think I need this role, and it feels like a little bit more of a checkbox type of role. And I actually don't really know why I need it. And if I don't do that level of diligence, then I make a bad hire because it's my fault that I've made a bad hire effectively.
Yeah, I can jump in. I think those are all good things just to get into, I guess, a level of detail when you're hiring and skill sets. Like for me, um I very much believe that people that join marketing organizations should have some baseline skills in copywriting, channel strategy, and like data analysis. Not that they have to be an expert in all those things, but I do like folks who have a baseline understanding, because those folks tend to be able to work cross-functionally because they understand how specialists operate and how to work with them. Just from just like an intangible standpoint, I think you're trying to ask questions to see um, people's work ethic. We do a lot of like assessments in the interview process just to see, are they willing to do the work and get the job done? Are they curious? Are they someone who continuously tries to learn? And then are they good at building relationships? Like, do they just have some of those skills around building trust with others, asking good questions, listening. So I think those are all kind of like foundational skills you're looking for in your team. Things that are red flags for me or have been in the past. I think if you find folks that work at big brands for a short period of time, they tend to have worked with agencies and they don't actually know how to get the work done. They know how to do the strategy and direct the agency, but the agency is doing the work. And so I've actually started to recruit and hire folks more from the startup scale up world that, those teams had limited resources. Annie, to your point around constraints, like they had limited resources, they had to learn the skill set, they had to actually get the work done. Because within our teams, whether you're a manager or director, you have to be able to write a subject line. You have to be able to do an A/B test on a landing page. Like if you have to jump in and coach and help your team, we want folks that are able to do that. And so those are kind of my red flags when I get into an interview. There are some folks that can talk about marketing strategy in theory, and they're very good at that. But poke a little bit, poke a little bit. What was your role on that project? Like, did you write the copy? Did you do the pitch deck? Did you have a partner who was your designer or your videographer to make the thing, or did you make it? And I think if you get into that level of detail, it's really telling around people's skill sets, and you'll start to learn how they operate, right? And they'll say things like, "Oh, I had a great partner on this." And as soon as they're acknowledging that of someone else, you're like, oh, okay, this person understands group dynamics and how to work with others. So those are the types of skills I'm looking for when I'm doing the hiring and recruiting.
Yeah, I agree with you, Jordan, in terms of listing your must-haves, and I agree with you, Kyle, in terms of the baseline skill sets of a marketer. I also think identifying the skills that can be learned, because I think sometimes hiring managers tend to look for this unicorn who hit all of these buckets, and sometimes is kind of unrealistic. And having that kind of must-haves, nice-to-haves, and baseline skills, I think it gives a little bit more room to take chances on people who might not fit the exact profile, but has a lot of room to grow. And in terms of red flags, to me, a really big red flag is if they can't give me an example, a very specific example of when they were being extremely introspective and being honest about the lesson that they learned, because we all make mistakes. We're all only human. Because everyone should be able to come with a very specific scenario or answer to that question.
Awesome. All right, I'm going to flip into Q&A. We've probably got time for a question or two. Question here from Maya. Thinking about your own work experience, what skills and character traits do you think make a great CMO? And alternatively, like what are some areas that you've seen lacking in CMO or marketing leader?
I've been lucky enough to report to two CMOs over the last couple of years, so I can tell you what's great about them. Um, their best partner is sales and finance. They completely understand how to drive the business forward, and then they're able to articulate what the marketing strategies and activities are that do that. Some of the CMOs that I've worked with probably could be CEOs of their own companies. They are just extremely well versed in the all the functions within a business, and I think they're able to build a lot of like cross collaboration opportunities within an org because they're able to see how all those dots connect to achieve a goal. I think that's something just as you grow your career, you just have to start to learn that piece of what's the internal narrative I'm going to shape and how do I drive revenue for my company. Um, as you're growing, I think one thing that becomes more and more difficult in a leadership position is prioritizing, right? Like you just have so many goals and team members and ideas. And I think one thing you have to really start to think through is just planning and prioritizing, because the unlock is actually when you get the entire org to move towards something together, and then you're able to do something much greater than an individual or an individual team. So that's a skill I think just constantly as you're moving up or you're becoming getting into a position of a CMO is thinking through, okay, I have all these resources at my disposal and these folks are looking to me for direction. Call the play, prioritize those plays, and I think the teams will certainly deliver. But that's been my experience is just be able to forecast things, put together the return on investment models, and then ultimately tell that story.
Yeah, I think when I consider the two CMOs that I've worked for that in my opinion were the best, um, they they each had, I guess, contrasting skill sets that if they were merged into like some superhuman CMO could probably make millions of dollars. So the first CMO was a legendary team builder. Came into the organization at a time when there was no leadership across marketing, just a bunch of discrete components in marketing not really working together. And it was really simple stuff, having all hands, creating a community, reflecting that everybody's work is really valuable, making the time to go deep on each of those specialties and make people feel heard, working across the executive level to really communicate the value of marketing to other department leaders who did not understand it at the time. So I would call that like, visionary leadership, which is like really, really important for a good CMO. But then there's this tactical piece of CMO leadership that I think a lot of visionary leaders lack. Not like being ageist, but there's a lot of CMOs who I think grew up in a different era with different tools, and they're coming into an environment where they might be falling behind. And I worked again for a younger CMO who didn't have as much of the legendary leadership capability, but had this tactical ability to go really deep into all parts of marketing and fully understand it, get their hands dirty, and demonstrate that they could do the work. And I think that is so important right now for our younger generations of marketers who are growing up in a world where, like, if you don't know how to find your way out of a paper bag in PowerPoint, like nobody's going to respect you. So, and I think that's really important to say out loud because, there are a lot of really great CMOs who've made brilliant careers, but I think the next generation of CMOs are going to not only have that visionary leadership capability, but also the ability to demonstrate their excellence, not only in a particular domain, but just showing that they can learn it and understand it. And as we talked about a lot this call, and as I talked about my MarTech course, marketing is becoming a lot more technical. And so I think the job requires marketers in the future to be able to go really deep and understand things. Again, that's not necessarily saying that like every CMO needs to be in a PowerPoint doc making edits, but I think if you can flex that muscle, like in an IC way sometimes, you build a lot of respect that you don't get when you're not in the trenches.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think like the expectations these days of heads of marketing, whether they be CMOs or VPs, is that there's an ability to go deep, right? And you are able to effectively like audit every single piece of your organization and sit there and say, I know what good looks like, and I know what you're doing, and I know like how that kind of like measures up against that. I'd say like this is where I think like the pendulum is sort of like swinging. And so I think the ideal piece of it is like you balance that with the team building. Because I think like what I also see are like a lot of folks that start to struggle at this level because they're so good at like that first kind of like how to get in depth, and they think more about how to do the work versus how do you help your team do the work, right? And it's really ultimately like being able to balance the two that leads to I think like the greatest degree of success. And so understanding that I think Austin, to kind of your point of like what's your capability, like what are you really good at first, and leaning towards that, but also really striving to grow that other area is like a really great way to begin to balance that piece of it out.
Yeah, I can share a few things based on my own experiences and mistakes that I've made, and also currently I advise a CMO, so I feel like I have a little bit of a close peek. And there are a few things that stand out. One is a person's ability to balance art and science. Some CMOs are amazing storytellers and they're super creative, and there are some CMOs who are super technical and super analytical. And it's their ability to learn the other brain skill and being curious enough to really kind of throw themselves into the other side. Secondly is picking and choosing your battles wisely. And it's essentially a prioritization skill, which I think leads to respect that is earned at their peer level and also above them, being the board and investors, if it is an earlier stage company. And then lastly is their ability to learn from their team and then also the upcoming generation, because I think if you think about Gen Z, for example, they're quickly entering the workforce and owning a lot of the disposable income in the economy. And so the ability to pivot and learn from the younger generation, I think is key for a successful CMO going forward.
I'm going to see if I can sneak in one more before we close. So question from Waithu. He is thinking about assembling a team that's both creative and data-driven technical. So far there's an agency involved that's more kind of on that intent and data-driven side. And so his questions are on like, how do you complement that with a creative team? Like one, would you build that creative team internally versus outsource? And two, just like, how do you think about ensuring that like the creative and the technical are collaborating effectively?
Right. So I think like it comes down to if you're on, and I think like Annie spoke to this before, right? Like if you're on one side of the spectrum, like how well do you respect the other side of the spectrum? I think is like the core question that comes to mind, right? So like I'm more on the quantitative bent. How well do I appreciate what the creative brings to the table? And how well do I think like it complements that aspect of it? And if you fundamentally don't have that to begin with, then it's almost like a non-starter of a way of collaborating because like there's just you fundamentally just don't believe that there's value there. And like one, like that's inherently false, but two, like getting somebody to get to that open mind is going to be a lot more difficult, right? Generally speaking, like I think like within like the respect of this question, I would say like I would absolutely like hire internally for that. Nothing worse than having two vendors basically blame each other for something and you don't really have anything else to go on. And so I think like building the team internally while also ensuring that they have like that healthy like dose of understanding and respect for like what the other side brings to the table is like the is I think like a strong starting point to building out like that more well-rounded team.
Yeah, plus one. I think vibe is hard to outsource, whereas very specific skills you can. And so the design team specifically, especially if it's a smaller company, I'm a big proponent of bringing that in-house. And then once you have very specific brand guidelines and specific visual guidelines, it's easier to outsource those things. But yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I think like in-house when you're starting to have a senior creative and then maybe one or two designers, maybe one designer, one producer is smart, but it doesn't let you scale. So I think you do want to have someone senior in-house to lay the foundational brand style guide and art direction, but have an agency partner that you trust that you can lean on for assets, production for a campaign. When it comes to the relationship between like marketing strategy and creative, I talk about this with my team a lot. Like, I think the brief is one of the most important documents in marketing, and we tend to be terrible at writing briefs. In the agency world, when you join an agency as a strategist, you're trained on writing briefs to partner with the creative team to get the best work done for the client. And when you go in-house, it's not something that's necessarily a trained skill. And we really, really work on that here. One of my favorite books is a masterclass in brand planning from Stephen King, Wunderman Thompson, 1970s. If you go into that book, it teaches you how to write a brief and how to teach a creative what you're looking for, but still allow them to do their job. And so I think you want to come to the table with what's my objective, who's my core audience, what's my message, what's some inspiration I have in market that I really like, so they get kind of your personal taste, but then allow the creative team to execute and do what they do. Someone had put it to me once, like, build the walls on the sandbox, but then, let the creative team create things inside of that sandbox. And that's where you'll find the overlap between the strategy and creative and make something pretty remarkable. So at least for me, I think have senior level creatives early on and then outsource the work and then train up your strategists and data-led marketers to be able to communicate properly with the creative team to get what you're looking for.
Awesome. Thank you. So we are right on time. So just wanted to wrap with huge thank you to our panel for the perspectives, Thanks to all of you in the audience for joining us. If this is top of mind for you as you're thinking about building your team, upskilling your team, I'd love to invite you to check out Reforge for Teams. So reforge.com/teams. You can get access for everyone in your team and really look to build out your squad. So thanks again and have a wonderful rest of your day.